Video is brought to you by MoviePalette.com and enter ROOM15 for 15% off of your palette. Hey horror fans, I'm the Blood Guy. Welcome back to another review of a serial killer documentary. So in my last video, I went over the 1992 documentary Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer, which I had never seen in its entirety up until that point. So now I'm doing the 2003 sequel, I guess you'd call it that, Aileen Wuornos, The Life and Death of a Serial Killer, which, yeah, it says the 2002 interviews. It was actually made right during the months leading up to her execution. It ends with her execution, actually. But it came out in 2003. It was released May 10th, which was actually just 7 months and 2 weeks before the release of Monster, which came out Christmas Eve of that year, which, great Christmas movie. I love this movie to death. But yeah, just as I suspected, this one feels more like an Aileen Wuornos documentary than, say, The Selling of a Serial Killer. The first one, of course, they're both made by Nick Broomfield, which at the time of the first one, he had not met Aileen. It was more about a documentary of people in her life and even law enforcement, possibly trying to get in on book and movie deals to make money off of her. This one does have a similar backdrop. Like, there is kind of a narrative to the documentary of what's going on in the background that's interspersed with archive footage or interviews, stuff like that. And that is, there was another word, basically a preliminary hearing. They mentioned it as an evidentiary hearing, which I believe it was her lawyer at the time made this complaint or plea about how there wasn't enough evidence to properly convict her and to relook at everything. And I think that's how Nick Broomfield got involved, because he had corresponded with Aileen for the 10 years leading up to this point. And so the documentary pretty much takes place between that hearing and her execution. And you get a lot more Aileen in this one. You get more interviews, whereas in the first one, she was really only in the last 10-15 minutes. But there is a lot of footage of her. I would say of the two, I do prefer this one. Because, I mean, even though I do like the story of this one, this does feel more like a documentary. It does go more into her past, you know, where she was born, her childhood in rural Michigan, interviews with people in her childhood, actually goes to Michigan, like where she lived, the place in the woods where she slept. It goes more into her life, actually, her life and her death. But also, pretty much all the archive footage of Aileen herself, like her January 16th, 91 confession, her testimony during the Richard Mallory case, the footage of Ty on the stand during the Richard Mallory case, the phone tap tape, her reaction to her sentencing when she's flipping everyone off. That's all in this. It does have a lot of the same footage, so I would say overall this is the better one, because you get all the footage from this and more. Plus you get, I think there's 3 interviews with this one, plus excerpts of the one from that film. So I will say this one's better, even though I do appreciate what Nick was trying to do with the first one. It does have that sequel feel. It does talk about, you know, the outcome of that film, sort of what it did to the life and the public outlook of her previous lawyer, Steve Glazer, what he went through, what came of the investigation with the police that was supposedly trying to get in on the movie deals. I don't think it mentions Arlene and her role in her life. You get interviews with Don Bodkins, who was her childhood best friend, and helped compile the autobiography Dear Dawn, which I don't own, but I would love to get it. But I do have her autobiography Monster, which I haven't read yet. This just came in, but of course I'm definitely interested in checking this out. This film definitely doesn't draw attention to the whole, first female American serial killer that the previous film did, which I do appreciate because technically that's not true, but I mean, that's not even a fault of the first film. It's what everyone was saying. But it is kind of a time capsule because you really it's loaded with news footage, and you can see just how closely the news in Florida was following. Oh, okay, so she's getting her execution date. Oh, they're waiting on Jeb Bush to sign it. Oh, Jeb Bush signed it. Oh, gave her a stay of execution. Oh, no, it's lifted. Now it's her execution. I mean, they were following it pretty closely. And it's all compiled on here. And, this is why I love documentaries like this. This is why I love physical media. Because I've seen some of these interviews. Mostly I've seen the final interview, and I think it's the second or third one that appears in this, where, it's they got the glass between them, and then there's the part at the end which he doesn't realize the camera's on and talks about self-defense. I had seen that one. I had seen the final interview a number of times, which this is another one where I haven't seen the film in its entirety. Which I think this is for free on YouTube, but again, I'm a huge sucker for, actually having a DVD. But I have seen the interviews, and now I'm glad to finally have them. And yeah, Nick was with her right up until the end. I don't believe he was present at the execution, but he was at the prison. He was in Stark, Florida, when it happened. It shows him talking to the press. He was a big advocate for, trying to either prolong her stay or even try to get execution off the table, because you really get the idea that he does feel bad for her. He's definitely not trying to sell her story in this. He's trying to expose people doing that in this. He does believe that she's not incompetent, but mentally ill, and he doesn't think it's right to execute a mentally ill person. And you can see it in the interviews. I mean, everyone's kind of talked about how crazy she seems in the interviews. So you can see him talking to the press, how, we tried to help her. It does show her she is kind of enigmatic, because even with Nick, it shows her going back and forth on whether it was self-defense or cold blood and robbery. Her stating how much she wants to die and is even sabotaging her own hearings and stuff like that. But then when she talks about her execution, she goes from being okay with it to being mad at the world and society and, everyone kind of screwing her. So you could really feel that Nick Broomfield was not trying to make money off of these. He was trying to get her story out, which I do appreciate. So yeah, it has almost all the Aileen footage and stuff from the news and the trials that was in the first film. It does go more into her past, not so much her crimes. Neither one really goes too deep into her crimes. We do get news interviews with some of the wives of her victims. We get an interview with her biological mother. And this is just a very interesting watch. And again, as I said in my video for the first film, Warnos has always been a case that's fascinated me. I first got into serial killers probably around 11 or 12 years old. And, right around the time that this came out. Right around the time that Monster came out. And when this came out, there was a ton of stuff on Aileen coming out. I mean, A&E, Discovery Channel, Special, History Channel, True TV or the True Crime Channel, Biography. There was a ton of stuff on her. I was already into serial killers, but, people in my family or just, were always watching stuff on her. So I was exposed to her story right around that time. And it always kind of stuck with me. I always found it fascinating. So I'm glad to own these two documentaries. Of course, there's a ton on her. I mean, hell, even Beyond Evil, or excuse me, Becoming Evil. One of the episodes is Lady Killers, which, of course, she's the most notorious. She's on the cover of a lot of books, just serial killers in general. Anytime there's a book on female serial killers, she's on the cover of them. She may not be the first technically, but she is the most notorious. And yeah, this may not be an in-depth look at her life, but it definitely it's worth the watch just to see where she came from, hear it from the people that were there. All the interviews with people are ones that were there with her. Some of the interviews in this were actually in the first film, like the guy Dick Mills, who was talking about this article about their sex life together. They lived together for a period. That interview is in here. There's another interview with a guy that lived with her out in the woods when she was a teen. It is very informative, but again, it's not your typical sort of like A&E documentary or Most Evil or Born to Kill, where it's like an hour in-depth look at her life and crimes. I mean, it does go over her life a bit, but it really is more so about, because at the time the first one came out, only 2 of her 3 trials had happened. They were getting ready for the third one. And this one is pretty much all leading up to her execution. And, it's in real time. There's even dates where her last interview is like October 7th, 2 days before execution. It shows him at the prison the day of. It's still very interesting. It's still a great watch. Excuse me. I do like these kinds of documentaries, ones that are not just textbooks on the screen, but ones that, made by filmmakers and, are there. Aileen is in a lot of footage that's not archive or interviews, her, like the hearings or whatever, with her sitting there, seeing her reactions to things. And really just a fascinating watch. I definitely recommend it if you haven't seen it. Yeah, it's for free on YouTube. If you have seen this one and thought, well, that wasn't very informative, it's pretty much just on one topic, you are right, but I still find it very interesting. This one may be more along the lines of what you're looking for if you want like a documentary like on her life. But almost all the footage that's in this is in this one. I wouldn't say skip over that one because there is some good stuff in there, story-wise, and what it's trying to tell about really the time of her arrest and trials. But I will say this one is better, and I really liked it. I really enjoyed it. I always found Aileen to be a very fascinating figure. It is pretty in-depth with stuff that was going on at that time, like, her execution being put off, and Jeb Bush giving her the stay of execution for evaluation, and then them saying that they only evaluated her for like 15 minutes, and they gave the thumbs up. But it's still a very interesting watch. I highly recommend it. And at some point, I will get the Dear Dawn autobiography. But until then, I just have this one. I got a ton of books for Christmas, so it'll be a while before I get to this one. But still, very good documentary. I'm glad I finally have it. I've been tempted to watch it on YouTube. Again, I've seen the interviews, but I really wanted to own it and be able to experience it for the first time while owning it. So, the 3 of these would make a pretty good viewing experience. Of course, on top of any kind of special or actual sort of true crime documentary that you can find, because there's probably 100 out there on her. So, yeah, very, very good. So now we'll just get into the summary and then sort of a vague summation of what the film covers. So as always, I like to give a brief summary on the killer that the film is based on. So Aileen Wuornos, often considered America's first female serial killer, killed 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990, and was arrested on January 9th, 1991, and confessed on the 16th. She was a drifting prostitute who would get picked up by male clients, then when in a secluded spot, she would shoot them to death and rob them. At least one was an officer, and another was just an elderly man giving her a ride. She claimed all murders were in self-defense of sexual assault, though none had been proven, despite her first victim, Richard Mallory, being a convicted rapist. Wuornos would later state all were in first-degree murder and robbery, but she always went back and forth between whether it was self-defense or whether it was in first-degree murder. Before and during her murder spree, she lived out of seedy motels with her lover of 5 years, Tyria Ty Moore, who would work with the police and eventually turned her over. She would also be infamous for her vulgar outbursts in the courtroom after her sentencing. During her stay in prison, she would go back and forth on her claims of self-defense and her guilt. Wuornos also made paranoid claims of the cops knowing what she was doing all along, and the prison guards systematically torturing her. She was finally executed by lethal injection on October 9th, 2002, at the age of 46. While she may technically not be the first American female serial killer, she is certainly the most notorious, with many books, documentaries, and movies have been made about her story, including the 2003 Oscar-winning film Monster. And so now really quick, just sort of the vague, and the movie obviously goes into way, way more, discusses way, way more. These are just sort of the highlights of some of the things that it covers. It does have pretty much a similar intro, or the same intro as the first film. Driving down into the remote areas off of Florida's I-75 highway, stating that Aileen Wuornos, female prostitute, America's first female serial killer, killed 7 men between 89 and 90. Some of the same news footage. So it has a lot, almost the same intro, but it also has like pictures of her as a young girl. Then closes with her January 16th, 91 confession tape. Footage of their first interview for the last film, and footage of the resignation of a police officer who was being looked into for selling her story. So it kind of recaps the ending to the first film. And then with Nick's voiceover, tells us why he's back in Florida and seeing Aileen. He was issued a subpoena. Well, first he says, he's been corresponding for the last 10 years. One day he gets a subpoena saying he has to appear in court because of his film and some of the stuff in it. Because there is this preliminary hearing that her new lawyer, Joe Hobson, is, trying to say that, due to the incompetency of her previous lawyer, she didn't get a fair trial, and there wasn't enough evidence to actually convict her or give her the death sentence. So that's why Nick has to be there. Which we also see her previous lawyer, Steve Glazer. We kind of wrap up things with him. We see him and Nick seeing each other for the first time in 10 years. At first, Steve doesn't seem very happy because it does go into things that happened with Steve due to the first film. How he was seen as very unfavorably, a very incompetent, maybe greedy lawyer, just trying to sell her story. So he wasn't seen in a good light, but it kind of goes over stuff with him. So yeah, the first half or so is kind of built around this evidentiary hearing, which we see Steve testifying, and there's all kinds of things, like him smoking 7 joints on the way to this one meeting with Aileen where he gave her legal advice to plead no contest, or whether he changed his shirt at some point, playing the documentary in the courtroom. We're introduced to Dawn Botkins, of course, from Dear Dawn. which was her best friend since childhood. Recap of Steve's legal advice and footage from her previous sentencing hearings. We get an interview with Aileen about her wanting to come clean. That's sort of her opening interview. Footage, and then we sort of get the repeat footage of Ty on the stand during the Richard Mallory case, Aileen on the stand, the tape of the phone conversation that was tapped. More footage of after she was sentenced in the Mallory case, when she was outside. There's even more footage from that wasn't in the first film. People from Eileen's childhood are on the stand. People from Michigan talking about this one guy talking about how he treated her like trash when he was in front of people. People say how they had sex with her at a very early age, when they were both at a very early age. Just kind of talking about her past. Then through voiceover and photos, we get family history, and the family history of the different forms of abuse that happened throughout the family, with all different people in the family. Dawn takes Nick to the spot in the woods where she lived for 2 years outside. Interview with Jim Dennis, who lived with Aileen for a period out in the woods. Then we get the second interview. This is the one where she's behind the glass, talking about corrupt cops. That's kind of her whole point in this film, wanting to sort of do more interviews in a documentary, is to try to expose the corrupt cops that, she stated knew what she was doing, surveilling her. She knew it. She talks a little bit about her family history. I don't remember if it was her or the film itself at first mentions her paranoia about being tortured in prison. News footage of the signing of her execution date, finally being set for October 9th of 2002. It does mention that it's in a election year, which Aileen, there's footage of her always saying that they're only giving me the death sentence because it's an election year. They want prestige. And now you have news footage even coming out and saying Jeb Bush signs her of execution. And this is an election year, so it goes into that, probably unknowingly. So then Nick goes back to Michigan to meet with Eileen's biological mother, Diane, and she gives an interview pretty much talking about her birth, her troubled birth, and how that might have led to some stuff. More news footage of how Jeb Bush gave the stay of execution so she could be evaluated, what came of that. The final interview with Aileen, October 7th of 2002, 2 days before her execution. And this is the one probably most people have seen, when she just gets really heated about the cops and going into detail about how she was tortured in prison. When she talks about how, everyone's getting rich off of me with books and movies and shit. And saying how we're all going to get nuked in 2019. A big rock's going to hit us. That interview. Then it says, day of execution, October 9th, 2002, 7 a.m., which we see Nick arriving at the prison. We see all the news crews. We see the news footage of them saying, today's the day. It was even a new special. It shows, the title card, date with death. It has a picture of her. It shows Nick talking to the press about how they're executing a mentally ill person, which he doesn't think is right. Then we get the press conference with the prison spokesman saying how, at 9:45, I think 9:40 something this morning, the sentence was carried out. She was very quiet. Says her last meal was KFC with Dawn. And then it just ends with, it shows Dawn on her farm with her dog, and it says Aileen was cremated. This song, she requested this song for her wake, and Dawn spread her ashes at her farm. And it plays the song that she requested. which it also shows Dawn at the hotel, sort of getting the funeral arrangements ready, like the clothes that she wanted to be, I'm guessing, executed in. I didn't know that you could do that, but apparently it is, or at least for her wake. But so yeah, that's Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer. I will say this again. This is the superior interview. Well, it is the superior documentary of the two. This one is still very good. Still an interesting story. This one kind of has more build up to the final interview with Aileen, whereas she's kind of the star of the show in this one. But you know, it has most, if not all, of the Warnos footage. Whether it be interrogation rooms, courtrooms, news footage, of interviews. It's pretty much all in here. This one does feel more like a documentary than that one does. That one's pretty topical. But they're both very good. They're both very solid watches, both very interesting. But this one does feel more like an Aileen Wuornos documentary. I will say this is the better of the two. But that's not to say this one's bad, because it's not at all. But I really enjoyed this. So again, if you're into the Wuornos story, these three would be a great watch, all three of them together. But you know, this is for free on YouTube. But personally, I would say just go out and buy it, because we do need physical media. And also get her book, Dear Dawn. Get this. There's other books on her, like they even interviewed the author in the first film. I think it was called Dead Ends. But in any case, there's a ton of other documentaries, you know, true crime documentaries like A&E, a series called Notorious Killers, Portraits of Evil, Most Evil Serial Killers, Born to Kill. If there's a documentary series on serial killers, there's one of Aileen. But I would say these are probably the best because they were made around her and with her. So yeah, I got more serial killer films and documentaries to get to. I got more coming in as well. So I got plenty to do. I'm not sure what order I'll be doing them in. But so yeah, stay tuned for those, and thank you for watching.